This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day, and that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This podcast contains adult themes and language, and some of the things that we discuss may be disturbing to some listeners. In this podcast, we discuss sexual assault, torture, race, and murder. Listener discretion is advised. Please take care of yourself.
So now we're going to head on down to the timeline. Frank applied. I was just thinking, ooh, we're going to rock down to Timeline Avenue. Frank applied.
We'll take it higher.
Yeah. Frank applied to the New Orleans Police Department the day that she turned 20, which was the earliest that she could apply. She did well on the physical and written test, but failed the psychological evaluations.
Frank lied and said that she'd never been fired from a job, but she, of course, had been fired from the Walmart in Opelousas and had lied about it on her application. And she neglected to mention that her brother, Adam Jr., was a law fugitive.
I mean, is it lying if you omit information?
Apparently it is.
Okay. Noted. From here on out, that's the code I'll live by. She also scored poorly on 2 standardized psychological evaluations. She invalidated the test because she was trying really hard to skew the tests in her favor. And she was below average on empathy, decision-making, rule-abiding, which comes up later, and impulse control. The psychologist who reviewed Frank's tests recommended a psychiatric interview.
So Dr. Scuria interviewed Frank for about 30 minutes. During the interview, he got the impression that she was preoccupied with making herself look good, and he also noted that she was a quote-unquote name dropper.
Uh-oh. Bad sign.
It's annoying.
Red flag, yeah.
Dr. Scuria found her to be average in social maturity and tolerance, emotional stability and competence, and assertiveness.
But he found her to be unacceptable in integrity and forthrightness. Big deals when you're a cop.
Yeah.
He rated her below average in insight and empathy, sound judgment and common sense, freedom from psychopathology, and conventional and rule-abiding.
In his report, Dr. Scuria wrote that Frank seemed shallow and superficial. He concluded by saying, "I do not feel that the applicant is suitable for the job of police officer." The misrepresentation of her job history was a major factor in his decision to find her unacceptable.
Oh, so they knew that she lied.
Yeah, they did, because they do background checks.
Well, I mean, they're so underfunded, I would think, and they
Yeah,
can't pay their officers.
Yeah, it could have gone through, but yeah, they knew.
Yeah, so she was technically denied a spot on the NOPD. She appealed the decision and enlisted a private psychologist's opinion to say she was okay. And she got letters of recommendations from judges and other police officers, some of whom were forged to support her getting a spot on the NOPD.
Apparently depressed about the possibility that she might not get her dream job, Frank then disappeared, leaving a suicide note addressed to her father. Her dad filed a missing persons report, but Frank turned up the next day. Less than 3 weeks later, the police department hired her anyway.
Wait, I just got this note, and then here you are. Can we talk about this for a minute?
Yeah, apparently she didn't tell her father what happened or anything. She didn't want to talk about it.
Okay. So I guess we just move on then. During the early 1990s, there was a crime wave in the city of New Orleans. The NOPD was chronically shorthanded and they needed new recruits. And also at the time, they were trying to recruit more Black officers and women.
Frank was hired in February of 1993 and graduated from the police academy the same month. I think it was like 3 weeks, which
Is that
seemed
all it takes for police
woefully
academy?
inadequate. Yeah, in New Orleans in 1993, apparently so. Yeah.
Oh, here I am thinking it took like months. Like,
Well, I think in a lot of places it does, but
not at
maybe
the time
not
in New Orleans.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Her platoon commander stated that she was accommodating and would try to do anything asked of her.
According to him, she seemed to get on well with her fellow officers, but her skills as police officer were limited to very basic assignments. She had problems with any assignment of an intricate nature.
But her fellow police officers described her as weak, indecisive, and some said she was borderline irrational. They said that she was not a joy to work with. She accused the male officers of sexually harassing her and the female officers of being quote unquote mean.
So when they were like, she's borderline irrational, not a joy to work with, like, that's something dudes say about any women that they are not pleased with. But if the female and the male officers are saying,
complaining,
this is not the one, then maybe the common denominator is you, Antoinette Frank. After her first 6 months on the force, her supervisor was close to having her return to the police academy for more training, but there was a shortage of manpower and she was needed on the streets. Instead, he teamed her up with a seasoned officer who was not happy about it.
On November 25th, 1994, Frank handled a shooting involving a man named Rogers Lacaze. Lacaze was raised by a single, religious and strict mother in New Orleans. He and his brother started hustling and selling drugs to survive. At about age 17, his mother kicked him out of the house.
Selling drugs. On that evening of November 25th, Rogers was shot and taken to the hospital. Officer Frank went to the hospital to show Lacaze a photo lineup. Investigators believe this was the first contact between the two, but Frank would later claim that she had met him months prior.
She followed his medical progress, then called and visited after his discharge from the hospital. Frank began giving him money, buying him gifts and clothes. She seemed to have good intentions at first. She helped him get his GED and find work. But by February of 1995, she'd purchased 2 cell phones, one for him and one for herself.
So we're getting closer to the crime. Frank and Lacaze began spending a lot of time together, and she did little to hide it from her fellow police officers and superiors. While Frank was on duty, Lacaze would ride shotgun with her in her police cruiser. On one occasion, when Frank responded to a report of an auto accident, Lacaze was riding in the front seat with her in the patrol unit.
At Frank's direction, Lacaze got behind the wheel and repositioned the unit. At another point, he directed traffic.
What?
Yeah. Other officers on the scene took him for an off-duty or plainclothes police officer, because who would do that?
That's insane. I picture, have you ever seen, there's like a clip of Shaq, he was in a movie and he was like a police officer in this crazy ass wig and he's directing traffic, but then it just turns into like a dance off. And that's what I picture it being like. Lacaze is just like dancing in the middle of the street, directing traffic. So this is crazy. While on duty and still in uniform, Frank would drive Lacaze in her patrol car unit to apply for jobs. Frank also took him with her when responding to calls, and when speaking with citizens, she would introduce him as her trainee. Whoa.
It is believed that the two embarked on a shakedown and robbery spree against other small-time criminals, and that Frank set up innocent people to take the fall for crimes she and Lacaze had actually committed.
Oh, there it is. The Kim An restaurant was a family-owned and operated Vietnamese restaurant. Nguyet Vu and her children had come to the United States from Vietnam 4 years prior, reuniting with Bic Vu, a husband and father that they had not seen for 10 years. Siblings Quang, Cha, Chow, Ha, Kwok, and Vui Vu worked together with their parents to make the restaurant a success. And the Vu family were very tightly knit, as many immigrant families and communities are.
Yeah. Officer Ronnie Williams, a married father of a 4-year-old who was expecting another child, worked security for the Kim On restaurant. Officer Williams grew up in New Orleans East, where he played football in school. When he turned 21, he joined the NOPD. He wanted to be a good cop and passed through the academy with flying colors.
Yeah, he was a good cop.
Yeah.
And by all accounts, a great man. And maybe this is racist of me. I'm sorry. But I saw the name Ronnie Williams and I was like, that's a brother. But Ronnie Williams is as white as they come.
Yeah, he was a white guy.
Yeah. I started writing that in the script and I was like, wait a minute. He's not black at all. So the Vus treated him like family because he and his wife were expecting another baby and he needed to have some days off. Officer Williams tapped Frank to help him with the security at Kim On. She would work security on the days that he could not.
During that time, the Vu family grew close to both Frank and Williams. They were very kind to Frank. They gave her free food, gifts. They even let her borrow money on occasion. When Frank brought Lacaze around Kim On, she introduced him to the Vus as her nephew.
Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts, guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place. For changes big and small. Loud or quiet. Find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
So when the scammer uses the hypnotic method of building rapport, then they create dysfunctional, delusional reality.
That's how a scam begins. Convincing the mark that it makes perfect sense to hand over their money to a con artist. The Scams and Cons podcast tells you how scams are run. You'll hear how people are convinced to buy fake art, buy machines that print money, or steal your house.
I get a phone call from my wife, and she let me know that they had decided to move all our stuff out. I could no longer do anything about it except go through an eviction.
And you'll hear it from the experts, people who run the cons.
So we go to your bank, you go in and get $6,000 cash, give us each $3,000, we give you this. You go home, and what you find out is cut up newspaper.
It's fun to know how the trick is done, and that's what Scams and Cons is all about. Listen at scamsandcons.com or wherever fine podcasts are found.
Frank knew the Vus distrusted banks. She also knew that they kept all their money in cash. During the weeks leading up to the robbery, Frank checked out a 9mm pistol from the NOPD evidence room, and she later reported the gun stolen. And the police in New Orleans at the time had to get their own guns. Like, they didn't get department-issued
Oh, they
weapons.
didn't get department guns, so
No.
they could check out guns from the evidence room.
That's my understanding.
Oh,
yes.
okay. Yeah, I was wondering about that, why she was allowed to do that, because that was all on the up and up, that she could check out that gun from the evidence room.
Yeah.
But she did report it stolen. So Lacaze was with Frank when a police officer arrived at her house to take the report about the stolen gun. Lacaze later told detectives that the report was bogus, that the pistol hadn't been stolen at all.
Maybe get your stories straight, Frank and Lacaze. On March 2nd, 1995, Frank and Lacaze stopped at Walmart to buy a box of 9mm bullets. Frank was on the clock, wearing her police uniform and driving a patrol car at the time.
On March 3rd, around 9 p.m., Frank called the Kim On to ask if she would be needed for the detail that night. Frank spoke with Chow Vu, the daughter of the owner. Chow advised Frank that she would not be needed, as Officer Williams would work from 11 p.m. until closing time, which was normally around 1 a.m.
After Frank completed her shift at the police station, she went home to change and then picked up Lacaze and drove to the Kim On. She entered alone, asking for cold drinks for herself and her nephew, quote unquote, who remained in the car. Frank spoke with Officer Williams and with Miss Vu.
And it was my understanding that she would just come in and get food and they would just give it to her for free. So she came in to get these drinks and they just gave them to her. She didn't have to pay for them. So Williams's shift at the police department had ended at 11 p.m. and then he had come straight to the restaurant to work the security detail. And Williams needed the extra money because 10 days earlier, his wife had given birth to their second son, Patrick.
Frank told Chow that she and her nephew were going to a midnight movie and left with the drinks. Business was slow that evening and the family decided to close early. Mrs. Vu went home, leaving her children to clean up.
Frank called the restaurant about 15 minutes later to order some food, saying that she had missed the movie. At this point, there were 6 people in the restaurant. Chow, who was 23, her sister Ha, who was 24, her brother Kwok, who was 18, and her other brother Kwang, who was 17, and a waitress named Tu, and 25-year-old Officer Williams. And I have not been able to find out what happened to the waitress too, but she may have left after this. This is after this part. I don't know what happened with her.
Yeah, I didn't see her name in any of the follow-ups.
Right.
Frank and Lacaze, who she said was her nephew, arrived at the restaurant minutes later and were the only customers. Their order was brought out in styrofoam containers, but Frank and Lacaze decided to eat there. Very suspicious.
Chow took close notice of Frank's dinner partner, later describing him to police as a short African-American man with several gold front teeth. Kwok, who was sweeping up around the tables, also made note of Frank's companion because he kept staring at him. Frank and the man left without finishing their meal, exited the restaurant, but remained outside talking.
The gold teeth is interesting. I have several uncles who have gold teeth in the front and are very proud of them.
Right.
And I also have a couple gold teeth. One of them is named Beyonce. And my dentists were always surprised when I was like, can I get a gold one? Like, I guess people don't ask for those anymore. I don't know. But, and there's that rap song, gold all in my mouth, gold all in my, I mean, gold teeth to, for the culture anyway, for Black culture is like a status symbol.
Yeah, like they're proud of them. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just haven't noticed that amongst my Caucasian counterparts. So
right, yeah, we usually go for the ceramic, I guess.
Yeah, that's white on white on white.
Yeah.
The restaurant had an attached grocery store with which the Vu family also ran. Chow went to the grocery side of the building, unlocked the doors, and bid Frank and Lacaze good night. Frank asked if she would be needed Saturday night for the security detail. After checking with Officer Williams, Chow said no, that Williams would handle it. The two got in Frank's car and drove off, and Chow locked up. So I gather like they were the Vus were close with Frank, but they did not like or trust her as much as they did Officer Williams.
Yeah. And they did not like Lacaze.
Right.
Yeah. And this part of the story, I got the feeling that Chow went to bid them good night, was like, get the fuck out of here. You know, that was her way. It's like, good night. I'm locking up now.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Never want to see you again.
Yeah. So shortly thereafter, Frank and the man returned for a third time. Okay. Chow had a bad feeling all night as Frank kept returning to the restaurant. She thought Frank was acting weird, and Lacaze actually scared her.
Yeah, this whole thing is ding, 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 like suspicious.
Something ain't right. Yeah.
But like Officer Williams is there, like, you know, what could go wrong? Like, he's here to keep us safe anyway. So,
yeah.
All right. Chow became frightened when she saw Frank coming back. She shouted to Officer Williams and Kwok not to open the doors. gathered the money she had been counting, and ran to the kitchen where her sister Ha and brother Kwang were cleaning. She hid the money in a microwave.
Kwok Vu had been talking with Williams and sweeping the floors when he saw Frank pull into the parking lot, maneuver her car, then exit and walk up to the glass door and begin shaking it.
Ooh, that's scary. Very, very scary. He called to Chow and moved toward the kitchen. Chow was leaving the kitchen area and coming towards him when suddenly Kwok saw Frank there inside the restaurant. It is believed that Frank had stolen a key earlier and just let herself in. Jesus, Santa Maria, this is crazy.
Frank began pushing Chow and Kwok back towards the kitchen, saying that they needed to talk. Officer Williams was behind the bar, and he moved in Chow and Kwok's direction. Lacaze, armed with the 99mm pistol, had come up behind Williams as Williams was facing away from him. I got the idea that he kind of snuck behind him while Williams was focused on Frank, Chow, and Kwok.
Lacaze shot Williams in the neck at close range, which immediately severed his spinal cord. Williams fell paralyzed, and Lacaze shot him 2 more times in the head and back, killing him. He then took the officer's revolver and his wallet.
Frank, who was in the kitchen, spun around and ran towards the bar and the front of the restaurant. While she was distracted, Chow and Kwok ran in the opposite direction, going deeper into the building. As they ran, they called to Ha and Kwang, who were by the stoves, to come along. But for some reason, Ha and Kwang did not follow.
And they were the 2 younger ones, right?
One of them was the youngest, I think.
Okay.
I think Kwang was the youngest.
So Chow and Kwok raced through the kitchen and into a large room-sized cooler situated between the kitchen and attached grocery store. Kwok turned off the cooler's lights as they entered and crouched down. From the darkened interior, he and Chow were able to see into the parts of the kitchen and bar through a small window.
The siblings heard more gunfire, but were unable to see who was shooting. Kwok observed Frank and her companion running around, rummaging, looking for the money. Then he heard gunfire from the area where he'd last seen his siblings, Ha and Kwang.
Frank, his heart must have just dropped.
Yeah.
Frank had forced Ha and Kwang to their knees, and the 2 siblings held hands and began praying and begging for their lives. Frank shot both of them at close range with the same gun Lacaze had used to kill Williams. Then the killers began searching for others. Assuming that they had all escaped, Frank and Lacaze left the restaurant.
Outside, Frank and Lacaze took off in Frank's battered 1977 Ford Torino. From her vantage point inside the cooler, Chow looked through the windows of the grocery to the parking lot and watched Frank's car pull out and drive away. But she and Kwok hesitated to leave the safety of the cooler.
Frank dropped Lacaze off at his girlfriend's apartment near the Kim An restaurant. I didn't realize he had a girlfriend. I thought that he was romantic with Frank.
Yeah. Their relationship, I'm not really sure exactly what their relationship was because like a lot of the TV shows focused on that they had this passionate smoking relationship. And that Frank and Lacaze said that they didn't. I don't doubt that they did. They probably did, but he also had a girlfriend. So I don't really know. They had an interesting relationship, let's just say.
Yeah, and there's always this element when white people tell the story about women killers or female POC killers. There's always this element of sex that they have to throw into it to make the story more interesting and believable.
Yeah.
And it is entirely possible that they just had a weird relationship that was like platonic, like maybe
it could have been platonic and they were just like BFFs, you know. But yeah, all of the TV shows focused on the allegation that they had this passionate sexual relationship, and I don't know if they did or not.
I don't either. But it is just interesting that they have to like inject that
story, yeah,
whether or not there's any evidence of it. That exists. So Frank told him not to worry, that she would return and take care of things. She would report that several black masked men broke through the back door of the restaurant and started shooting. She would be able to do this because there ain't no way that anyone would ever believe she had anything to do with it.
Frank returned to the station house to swap out her personal car for a patrol unit, which she then used to return to the scene. Meanwhile, Chow left the cooler to try to reach the telephone or her cell phone at the bar.
Her telephone, normally kept on the bar, was gone. Going to retrieve her cell phone, Chow saw Officer Williams' body still in police uniform. Officer Ronnie Williams was face down behind the bar in a pool of blood. Chow then lost all confidence because the person that protects us is lying right there. Whew.
She returned to the cooler with her cell phone and attempted unsuccessfully to call 911. She was so distraught that she was unable to communicate clearly, and it's my understanding that she was having trouble speaking English and had reverted to her native language of Vietnamese. And I can only imagine that would be a nightmare.
Yeah, absolutely. She finally reached a friend and asked him to call 911. The friend's call was received by 911 operators at 1:48 a.m. In the meantime, Kwok left the cooler on the kitchen side to look for his brother and sister, Kwang and Ha. He found them both lying in pools of blood.
Kwang Vu had been an altar boy at St. Bridget Catholic Church. He had played high school football and wanted to be a priest. Ha Vu was considering becoming a nun. Both worked long hours at their parents' restaurant.
So this is totally unrelated, but at one point in my life, I wanted to be a nun after watching all of the Sister Act movies and realized, wait, I'm not Catholic, so I can't do that.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Ha Vu had died instantly. She was still on her knees. Her forehead was resting on the floor. Kwang Vu took longer to die. God, that breaks my heart. Frank had shot him repeatedly in the chest and back. When Frank heard him trying to talk, he shot him again, firing 2 bullets into his head.
Kwok decided to leave and try to reach a friend's house to call the police from there. Kwok's call from his friend's home was received by 911 operators at 1:50 a.m.
All right, so now we're going to get into the investigation and the arrest. So the police unit arrived on the scene at 1:52 a.m. Officers Wayne Favre, not the guy from Super Troopers, this officer Wayne Favre and Reginald Jacques pulled into an empty parking lot. Jacques went around the back while Favre approached the front.
Chow had waited, quote unquote, so long in the cooler for help to arrive. She saw one patrol car pull up, but hesitated, quote, not wanting to go outside because I know Antoinette is police too. When she heard more sirens approaching, she felt safe enough to leave the building.
Chow darted out of the building and ran towards Officer Favre. Favre observed a black female running a short distance behind the Vietnamese female, whom he recognized as another police officer, Antoinette Frank. What are you doing here?
Frank had returned to the restaurant just seconds before the police. As Chow ran from the restaurant, it appeared that Frank was running after her, but she was stopped by the officers. She identified herself as a police officer and said that 3 masked men had escaped out of the back door. Chow was still having difficulty speaking English.
Wow. So, shout out to Chow for escaping the grasp of Frank.
Right.
But then the audacity of Miss Frank to, at this point, believe that the jig is not up. She still got it. Favre entered the restaurant with the semi-hysterical Vietnamese female right behind him. The bodies of Ha and Quang were found next to the stoves, each shot multiple times. Officer Williams was shot 3 times. After quickly checking all 3 victims, Favre made the appropriate notifications by radio, then withdrew to the front of the restaurant.
Arriving close behind him in another unit was his wife, Officer Yvonne Favre, who pulled in as her husband had entered the restaurant. She attempted to follow him, but was stopped by Chow, who bolted from the building crying and shouting. Yvonne Favre later testified that she, quote, just grabbed onto me, so I held her. Frank had reached out to grab Chow, but she, quote, saw the lady with the uniform and ran to her, and she hugged me.
Oh, man. You know, I don't say nice things about police officers on this show very often, but this one, Yvonne Favre, sounds like a good one.
The truth about the Haditha massacre has been covered up, but not anymore.
I know you know what happened.
They went into houses and killed women and children.
What are you thinking?
What a mess.
U.S. Marines murdered innocent civilians in cold blood.
And at the center of it all
is 25-year-old Sergeant Frank Wuterick.
And me. Murder in House 2. A new podcast from Crowd Network.
Frank kept asking Chow where she and her brother had hidden and what happened to her sister and other brother. Chow answered, "You was there. You know everything. Why you ask me that?"
Sensing Chow's fear, the female officer pulled Chow away and told Frank not to leave. Slowly, Chow was able to say what had happened. Chow told her that Antoinette and a short black man with gold in his teeth had come in and were just shooting everybody. When Kwok returned to the scene, he validated what Chow had said.
Antoinette Frank was questioned at the scene and then taken into custody. At first, Frank said that she was outside the restaurant when the shootings occurred. When confronted with the information that Chow and Kwok said, she changed her story and claimed that she had been in the back of the restaurant when the shootings began, and she had escorted Chow and Kwok out the back door.
But investigators found that the back door was locked. They also questioned why she did not call police on her radio and why she did not provide assistance to her fellow police officer.
Very reasonable questions.
Yes. Realizing that she was caught, Frank confessed to being present when the murders occurred, but claimed that the robbery was Lacaz's idea, and she had been forced to participate. After this confession, she actually asked if she would lose her job over this.
What? Ma'am.
And one of the officers described her as delusional.
I'll say. Police found and took Lacaz into custody. When they were each interrogated, they pointed the finger at each other as being the trigger man. Frank finally said that she shot the younger brother and sister, but only because Lacaz had put a gun to her head. Lacaz said he was present at the scene but didn't shoot anyone. They were both charged with armed robbery and murder.
The microwave oven where Chow Vu tossed the uncounted currency was empty. Neither the money nor the murder weapon were ever found.
Oh, interesting. So now we're going to get into the trial. Lacaz's trial was first. He tried to convince the jury that he was not at the restaurant and that Frank had acted alone. They claimed that she was upset about the Vus had cut her hours, but evidence was presented that Lacaz had used Ronnie Williams' credit card at a gas station about 45 minutes after the murders. Gotcha.
The jury took 90 minutes to find Lacaz guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death by lethal injection.
On September 5th, 1995, Frank's trial began. In October 1995, a jury took 22 minutes to find Frank guilty, and she was also sentenced to death by lethal injection for the murders of Officer Ronald Williams and Ha Kwang Vu. You cannot kill a police officer and get away with it in this country.
Yeah. After her trial, a dog dug up human remains in the crawl space under Frank's house.
Oh, boy.
The skeleton of a male who had been shot in the head was unearthed. The remains have never been officially identified, but are assumed really, to be those of Adam Frank Sr., who Antoinette had reported missing in 1993.
Holy shitballs. Because Frank was already sentenced to death, prosecutors elected not to pursue that case.
But yeah, she's a serial killer. She killed her dad.
Yeah, I think so. So now we're going to get into where are they now? Hit it, Beth.
In 2006, Frank's lawyers tried to get her death sentence overturned. They argued that the defense had not been allowed to conduct an investigation into the defendant's background for possible mitigating evidence.
Frank's attorneys introduced the testimony of psychiatrists who said that traumatic events in Frank's childhood, such as physical, psychological, and sexual abuse, could have affected her behavior at the time of the murders, and she may have been suffering from PTSD.
But a state psychiatrist disagreed that Frank showed symptoms of trauma. He agreed with the diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial tendencies given to Frank by doctors at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women.
PTSD is an interesting one. And I was listening to a podcast talking about how coronavirus is causing PTSD for everybody, including children.
Oh, wow.
Who
not
are,
good.
Yeah, so not good all around. Anyway, on May 22nd, 2007, the state Louisiana Supreme Court ruled 5-2 that the death penalty should be upheld. Antoinette Frank is currently incarcerated, as we said at the beginning of the show, on death row at Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, Louisiana. She's the only woman on death row in the state of Louisiana.
On July 23rd, 2015, Judge Michael Kirby granted Rogers Lacaze a new trial because a former police officer had been on his jury, which was a violation of jury rules. The appeals lawyers also alleged that prosecutors had improperly withheld evidence that suggested it may have been Adam Frank Jr., not Lacaze, who helped Antoinette Frank carry out the robbery and murders.
Oh, I forgot about her fugitive brother.
Right.
Adam Frank Jr. was brought to the New Orleans Criminal District Court from Angola prison, where on the witness stand, he swore he did not participate in the March 4th, 1995 triple murder. He said he moved to Rayville in northern Louisiana and was not even in New Orleans when the murders occurred.
Frank also testified that he had gone to the Kim An with his sister and that he would sometimes speak with Chow Vu. Chow Vu testified that Lacaze was Antoinette Frank's accomplice, not Adam Frank Jr. And in 2019, Lacaze was resentenced to life without parole.
It's interesting that he did not get the death penalty.
He did.
I thought it was life without parole.
He got the death penalty in his first trial, and then he was retried. And the second trial, he was resentenced to life without parole.
So the death penalty is out because he got the retrial.
For him, because he got the retrial. Yep.
Okay.
And this was in 2019, so, the mood has changed.
On the death penalty?
Yeah.
Huh, interesting. And I used to be rah for the death penalty, but but only because in my head I was like, oh, well, if somebody did something wrong, they shouldn't cost the system more money. But it actually costs more money to
put somebody to
put
death,
somebody on death row. Yes.
Yep.
And also we incarcerate and put a lot of innocent people on death row. So the idea
That's
of
always
getting
been
it wrong,
my opinion.
Yeah.
If there's any chance that any of these people on death row are innocent, even one of them, then we should not have the death penalty at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of the people who get the death penalty are people of color, and it weighs more heavily on the Black community than on the white community, and it's not fair, and also it costs more money. So all of that.
So pick your argument, pick your side. It's wrong all around. Mary Williams, the wife of Officer Ronnie Williams, grew very close to the Vu family. They spent a lot of time together. Lastly, the Kim An restaurant moved locations and changed its name to Kim An Noodle House, but they are still in New Orleans.
Yep.
So now we're going to get into what we think made Ms. Frank snap, as well as our takeaways from this case. I'll let you go first, Beth.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Antoinette Frank's early life apparently sucked. Both she and her mother said that her father was abusive and would throw fits of rage, like tear things apart, throw things across the room, stuff like that. Frank did claim that her father sexually abused her, but this was only after the trial when she was interviewed by some psychologists and they were looking for mitigating factors. So I don't know if that actually happened. All of the psychologists agreed that if she had been sexually abused, it would have been more likely than not that it would have showed in her behavior at the time when she was a preteen / teenager. But it did not. She did well in school and was successful. So they didn't totally rule it out, but they did question it.
Well, I was just going to say, because, Tara Reid and Joe Biden stories in the news, and I think of Christine Blasey Ford, and when something like sexually or anything traumatic happens to you, like your brain doesn't remember it in a linear fashion.
Right.
And so she could have been sexually abused.
Yes.
Just maybe she didn't remember it in a linear fashion,
Block it out,
and wasn't able to express it until later on in life. We don't really know if she was or not. But
we don't know. Yeah, I'm just saying what they said.
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible she was. It's possible she wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
I think she wanted to be a cop for all the wrong reasons.
Mm-hmm.
She liked the power and authority that it gave her. And when she hooked up with Rogers Lacaze, they influenced each other in a very bad way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He was also younger than her. I think he was 18 and she was in her 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And he also, which we didn't mention earlier, he had a low IQ. It was a little above 70.
Oh.
And so I think she liked having influence and power over him, which she did not have with her fellow officers who did not like her.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that she was angry with the Vus and Williams because they weren't giving her the amount of work, meaning money, that she thought she deserved, even though the Vus had been incredibly kind to her. And Williams was the one who actually gave her the job.
Right.
She was ungrateful and entitled. And there may be an element, too, with Lacaze where maybe she talked up her game and wanted to impress him about how badass she was, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But what really bothered me about this case is why she felt it was necessary to kill these people. She knew them. She knew all of them. She was friends with them.
Mm-hmm.
And if she had a key to the building, she and Lacaze could have entered after everyone left and stole the money.
Right.
If the object of the robbery was the money, there was a better way to go about it.
Mm-hmm.
So there had to be something that made the actual crime, the robbery and murders, necessary to her, like revenge, a sense of power, showing off to Lacaze, something like that. Because otherwise they could have just robbed the restaurant when everybody was gone and nobody would have been the wiser.
Hot takes, Beth. It sounded to me like I don't think she snapped.
No.
There was a need for her to earn more income, the abysmal pay that the NOPD officers made. She shouldn't have allowed to be a cop in the first place, given her psych evals, which basically showed she had narcissistic personality disorder, had no empathy, and didn't think rules applied to her.
Right.
I also think that there was an element of her maybe thinking that immigrants were somehow inept because their English wasn't great and they were kind of innocent and seemed like easy targets to her, which is fucked up and an ugly American thing to do. These people were immigrants. But not only that, they were business people. Like Jay-Z says, I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman, which takes skill and intellect.
Yeah.
But hold the fuck on, she didn't count on them being able to articulate that it was her. And she wildly underestimated them.
Yeah.
And this was a messy, poorly thought out crime. And I also think that she was thinking that she could hide behind her badge or like some Blue Lives Matter bullshit to get off.
Right.
And guess what? That only works for white male cops. So the joke's on Frank.
Beth, where can the people find us?
Our website is fruitloopspod.com, and we use Fruit Loops Pod for all of our social media.
This is a weekly podcast, and new episodes drop every Thursday. So until next time, look alive, y'all. It's crazy out there.
Ohio is a land of mystery, from missing shipwrecks and lost treasure beneath her surface to strange phenomenon slicing through her skies. From myths that have evolved around historic events and people to the unsolved murders and disappearances that keep her communities wondering what happened. Find Ohio Mysteries on your favorite podcast app, and let's explore the inexplicable. OhioMysteries.com.
From DNA testing to the Dixie Mafia, Crime Capsule brings you new stories of true crime in American history. I'm your host, Benjamin Morris. Join us for exclusive interviews with authors from Arcadia Publishing, writing the hottest books on the most chilling stories of our country's past. You can find us wherever you get your favorite podcasts or on evergreenpodcasts.com. Crime Capsule. History so interesting, it's criminal.